welcome back to the LSE Future of Humanity Summit. In our first panel of the day, we'll be looking at the near-far problem, how we can respond to the problem of climate change. Our chair for the panel is Kenneth, who's the chair of the LSE Alumni Association, and a lawyer at Google, where he specializes in technology, commercial and data protection law. Through the Alumni Association, he's curated events, content and podcasts, focusing on technology, innovation, and the social sciences, including London 2050, a full virtual day showcasing inspiring ideas around how technology activism and how policy can positively shape the future of the City of London. So I'll hand over now to Ken. Ken.
Thanks very much, Joseph. So welcome everyone. And before I start, I'd like to say a sincere thank you to LSE Public Debates, the LSESU Effective Altruism and Debate Society, especially Hamza and Sami for their efforts in putting together this event and inviting me to moderate this panel, and Alex O'Connor and the team at Future Impact Society for their contributions to this panel as well. Special thanks also to the Global Policy Journal for their support of the summit as a whole. In terms of the order of today's event, I'll introduce the panel shortly and invite them to make opening remarks for about 5 minutes apiece. We'll then go into moderate discussion for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then take your questions and place them to our esteemed panel. A note to attendees: unfortunately, for personal reasons, Director General 𝗖𝗵_𝗶𝗺 will not be able to join us today for today's session and sends his apologies. We are hopeful that he will be able to join us for future events, but we have a fantastic panel who I'm confident will be more than capable of the task of filling the gap that he leaves. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. We have Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs, Director of Columbia's Center for Sustainable Development and President of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, who the New York Times called probably the most important economist in the world. We have David Wood, Chair of the London Futurists, one of the city's preeminent technology groups focusing on the impact and scope of technology on society and humanity, and Principal at Delta Wisdom, an independent futurist consultancy and publisher. Juergen Braunstein, Fellow of the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center, where he works on the geopolitics of energy project with research interests in green energy, the green energy revolution, and energy markets in general. Dr. Piera Patrizio, Research Associate at the Center for Environmental Policy in the Faculty of Natural Sciences of Imperial College London, with research interests in the region-specific potential of negative emissions technologies, and the connections between energy modeling, the social sciences, and climate policy. So a very warm welcome to all of you. It's a privilege to have you all here. With that, I'd like to start by opening up for opening statements. If it's okay with you, Professor Sachs, could we start with you?
Very good, thank you. And what a delight to be with this wonderful panel. And thank you, Ken, for moderating the panel. I think we're on a new trajectory with respect to climate after a long time of talking and negotiating. Some key pieces are coming into place, albeit very late in the day. We know from the Paris Climate Agreement and from the IPCC and many other pieces of evidence that we had better move. The Paris goal is to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, and we're at approximately 1.2 degrees Celsius and rising between 0.2 and 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade on the current trajectory. So we are very late in the day. The good news is that the notion of reaching net zero by 2050 is rapidly becoming the global norm. The commitment of the European Union, of UK, of the United States, of Korea, Japan, and about 30 other countries, whether in process or already in policy, means that I believe we're reaching a tipping point globally in terms of how we define the actual policy framework at this point. We're moving beyond rather ineffective tools like cap and trade and carbon taxes and so forth, which were of course, pieces of the puzzle, but we're not really comprehensive pathways to decarbonization. The fact that there is now a clear target, 0, and a latest date, 2050, I think will make a very big difference. The nature of policymaking is therefore changing. We're talking a lot more about pathways and policy frameworks than we are about single instruments like prices or tradable permits or other things which are at best limited tools to an overall policy framework. When one analyzes all of the policy frameworks and pathways that are on the table right now, they're very, very similar. And that is to reach net zero electricity, to electrify everything that can be electrified, which is most of transport, at least light duty vehicles, housing for heating, and to have a hydrogen and other green energy path as well, that is where those green energies are produced by zero carbon electricity. So the idea of clean grids, strongly electrified cities, electrified economies to the maximum extent possible, and then hydrogen and other green fuels as the addition, are part of essentially every path analysis that is on the table right now. I would argue that this is a realistic framework. It is a framework that can be guided heavily by regulation, by timelines, by zeroing out internal combustion engine vehicles during the 2030s, by regulation on siting of new power plants and so forth. And so I think that it is an operational framework. And from what I think we know about technology, what we have now and what's within reach, it is a financeable framework as well. It requires a lot of regional cooperation, I should add, because virtually no country should do this on its own. One needs, especially with intermittent power, one needs connectivity. And so we need a high degree of international cooperation and regional cooperation for this to occur. So I'll end here in the opening to say that I think we have a better policy framework, more clarity, more commitment. And I think the goal for Glasgow should be that every country comes to Glasgow with a mid-century plan for reaching net zero, and that we use the diplomatic space remaining between now and Glasgow to move all the remaining regions to understand that is the new global framework. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. David, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Ken. As a futurist, I believe it's important and useful to consider a variety of scenarios for what the future might bring. And as for the range of possible climate change scenarios, I want to emphasize that there's a very long tail of possibilities. The worst incident of climate change in all of the history of life on this planet wiped out, by some counts, around 95% of all species in a mass extinction event known as the Great Dying. That was a long time ago, 252 million years or so, but the lessons from it deserve our attention here in the present time, I believe. The mechanisms for that Great Dying extinction are believed to have involved rapid temperature increase caused by the explosive release of greenhouse gases from long buried carbon deposits. Although an extreme, that Great Dying was by no means a unique event. Paleontologists talk about 5 great mass extinctions, and in each case, elements of substantial climate change were likely involved, accelerated by feedback effects. To be clear, I'm not saying that another Great Dying is nigh, but I do want to point out the possibilities of scenarios in between. On the one hand, total extinction of all humans, and on the other, mere linear extrapolations of current trends. These intermediate scenarios, which we might call exponential climate change, involve interactions of effects that become more intense once tipping points have been passed. Ice sheets disintegrating, vast forests burning down, releasing lots of embedded carbon, etc. Now, these exponential scenarios are uncertain in many ways, but that's no reason to shut them out of our mind. On the contrary, it's a reason to take them more seriously, and I welcome the chance in today's event to do so. There are already some worrying signs. For example, the large-scale north-south ocean currents deep in the Atlantic, known as 𝗂𝗏, seem to be weaker now than at any time in at least the last 1,000 years, and it's unclear why they are so weak. There's also evidence of rapid temperature changes not so long ago in geological terms, a rise of perhaps 8 degrees centigrade within just 30 years at the end of what's known as the Younger Dryas, 11.7 thousand years ago. As a futurist, I want to stress that the most volatile, unpredictable scenarios tend to involve combinations of natural changes, human-induced changes, technological changes, and subsequent additional human interferences. Let me briefly look ahead 10 years to a possible scenario in which some national political leaders have become extremely agitated by what they see as slow progress to fix climate change. They're agitated by increases in severe weather events, floods, droughts, storms, fires, and so on. It's about 10% likely, in my view, that at some stage, the global political discussion will become dominated by inflamed arguments over possible emergency geoengineering interventions. And we know that in times of crisis, we sadly can't be sure that calm heads will prevail. We do know that political leaders sometimes act with excess bravado. One former US president apparently considered unleashing a nuclear bomb on a hurricane to somehow defeat that hurricane. Other political leaders have strenuously denied the science of, for example, COVID infections. So imagine some populist leader in 2031 taking a unilateral decision to release huge amounts of sulfur dioxide particles high in the stratosphere to try to cool the Earth down, as some people have recommended. Imagine angry attempts by other countries to stop such actions at all costs. Imagine alongside global rising temperatures, global rising emotions. Imagine some leader in desperation reaching for the nuclear attack trigger. That's just one way in which climate change could lead to human catastrophe, perhaps even human extinction. This is climate change acting as a stress multiplier rather than just being an isolated trend. I offer such a prediction for 2031, not because I want it to become true, of course, but because I want it to be a self-unfulfilling prophecy. I want to reduce the chance of humanity ever coming close to such a perilous situation. And so I look forward to this panel to discussing the ways to prevent such a danger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Piera, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, thanks again for inviting me to join this panel. It's very good for my knowledge and for my scientific knowledge especially. So perhaps I'd like to bridge a little bit on what Professor Sachs just mentioned with regard to the energy transition, since this is my main field of expertise, and relate this a little bit on what could be the contribution of social science in helping us getting where we need to go, which is net zero. So from what we know, of course, reaching a decarbonization of our energy system, it's a huge challenge, and will imply also a radical transformation in the way we conduct our economic activities, and also will also have unintended impact also on local community and on people that actually make their living, let's say, on this type of old type of energy transformation. So it is very important, and this is where I think social science can contribute. And I think that there are very different areas in which social science can help shaping these pathways, but I would like to point it out to mainly two of them. And one is it can be defined as socioeconomic impacts, and the other one on stakeholder engagement. So with regard to socioeconomic impacts, as we all know, we know where we need to go. We know that it's going to be challenging, and we need to find a way to get from point A to point B. What social science can do is translating the human dimension into quantitative measure and quantify the socioeconomic impacts in terms of job losses, economic opportunity, and social value that are related with certain pathways. Because yes, it's true, we're going to have major disruption in local communities, and we're going to have employment losses. But at the same time, this transformation comes also with employment opportunities, and there are no one-size-fits-all solutions, but each pathways would need to be shaped by taking into account the human capital, the resource, and the geopolitical condition of each region. The second point where social science, I think, can make a contribution is on the social acceptability and on stakeholder engagement. Because what is clear is that we need a mix of measures. For sure, in my opinion, in order to get to net zero, we have some priorities. And the first one is for sure energy demand reduction. The second one, it's fuel switching, because of course we need to produce energy with cleaner fuel. But the third one is greenhouse gas removal technology, because we need to offset residual emissions from our economic activities that are still going to be there, because for sectors that are very difficult to decarbonize, such as the chemical industry or the iron and steel industry and so on. And greenhouse gas removal technology comes with a whole bunch of trade-off and unintended consequences. For instance, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is a technology that allows to produce, let's say, negative emissions, so remove carbon from the atmosphere permanently, has huge implication in terms of land use and biomass resource use. Direct air capture has big issues related to energy use, because it's very energy intensive. And so there is a portfolio of measures. None of them is a silver bullet. We need all of them to work together. And most importantly, we need stakeholder engagement, because by designing GGR, so greenhouse gas removal portfolio, together with local community and different stakeholders in different regions, then we can make this work, and we can make this portfolio solution acceptable to the local community. So I just leave it there for now, but I'm very happy to discuss this further.
Thank you very much, Piera. And I guess on the topic of stakeholder engagement, it's very timely. Over to you, Juergen, and then I think we can start the moderated discussion. Thank you.
Great. So it's great to be back at LSE, although virtually. And after having discussed or after having heard sort of a stock taking of where we are right now and where the future should go and where we all agree to. And the question is how to address this. And one important element of addressing climate change risks is the energy transition. So it's the change from one energy fuel mix to another one. And as we all know, predicting the future and predicting the shape, I would say, the energy transition is a very tricky undertaking. Why? Because it involves many uncertainties. Some might agree or not in terms of because it's a long-term process, first of all. It involves technological uncertainty. but more prominently, it involves decisions of policymakers of sovereign states. However, this should not keep us away from making an informed guess about the potential transition futures, which I'm sure we will discuss later. But first, we should acknowledge that this is not the first time that an energy transition in more general terms happens. So we have witnessed this transition before, from a world that was powered by wood, then by coal, and then the shift to fossil fuels. What we also know is that past experience tells us that energy transitions are intimately connected with geopolitical transitions. For instance, just consider the concentrated nature of coal deposits, which facilitated infrastructure projects, canals and railroads, and the endowment with coal in combination with technology, as Professor Sachs recently highlighted in a recent book, allowed, for instance, the tiny island of Great Britain to become the leader in the Industrial Revolution and in the world markets and beyond. And the same story was somehow repeated in the 20th century when we look at the United States and when new players emerged on the geopolitical map, notably the Persian Gulf, which supplied Western Europe with cheap oil after the Second World War. More recently, we have also experienced, and you can see I'm not very green until now, but I also want to emphasize that more recently we have experienced this boom in unconventional oil and gas. Also, it's called the shale and oil revolution. And one of my colleague from Kennedy School, Megan O'Sullivan, illustrates this disruptive impact of this shale and oil revolution on geopolitical realities by highlighting that this boom has helped many countries to transform to some extent their economies and to become less dependent on oil and gas imports. So what does this mean for the United States? So it helped, this boost in unconventional oil and gas has increased the United States soft and hard power, but it has done so through market mechanism. And that's important to note this, because it means that the US influence has expanded globally, although despite Washington under the administration of Trump has adopted the policies of retrenchment. By contrast, if we look at Russia, this unconventional oil and gas boom over the last decade, has it made more difficult for Russia to use natural gas as a geopolitical weapon, or geopolitical tool. And it has also to some extent frustrated Russia's attempts to permeate Asian markets. What about China? The renewables and unconventional oil and gas somehow softened constraints on China's foreign policy, which used to be so far almost exclusively focused on ensuring access to energy. So we can sort of already see, and in terms of it, this allowed China also to increasingly adopt non-energy related foreign policy. So if this boom in this unconventional oil and gas has already affected geopolitical realities over the last 10 years, then just imagine how a much more comprehensive energy transition towards zero net emissions will shape these geopolitical realities. And I'm sure we will talk about specific scenarios later.
Wonderful, thank you, Juergen, and thank you very much to the panel for their opening remarks. So we're now going to go to into a moderated discussion. I'd like to frame my questions in three parts. So in the first instance, I'd like to discuss how climate change can be considered an existential risk within the paradigm of what we mean by existential risk. And I think as David alluded to in his comments, the continuum of how we consider those risks. We'll then go to evaluating the impacts of climate change and stakeholder engagement amongst key actors within the current context. And I think then we can transition to looking at strategies for addressing the same. So I'd like to go to you first, David, in terms of, I think the academic, or rather the specific definition of an existential risk is rather more specific than perhaps what a layman would consider. Can you maybe unpackage that for us and maybe speak a little bit more to the likely risk scenarios that climate change throws up? And particularly, I think one of the things you mentioned was in relation to the ancillary effects of climate change, because I think when most people think about the impacts of climate change, they just assume the Earth would warm up to a point at which it's unlivable for humans, and that is the likely end dystopian view of what climate change is. But the situation is probably more nuanced than that. So if we could start there, and then we'll go around the panel.
Thanks, Kenneth. So as you point out, there is an academic discussion about when a risk is merely catastrophic and when it is existential. And I don't get too excited by that discussion personally, although I can see from a certain point of view, there is a big difference as to whether humanity manages to survive and fight again in the future and give rise in the end to vast numbers of people, which is possible. That's one scenario, one set of scenarios. And there is a difference there between a merely catastrophic, in which vast numbers of people would have even worse consequences than today. To be clear, there is already some catastrophic effects on people's lives with today's extreme weather. There are people whose livelihoods are destroyed and people who are being burned to death because of forest fires, which are likely made more probable because of climate change. So I don't want to agonize on this distinction, but I do want to point out that things could be worse than some of my fellow speakers have indicated. I'm all in favor of energy transition plans, and I think it's fantastic, as Juergen was talking about. But let's also refer to 𝗣𝗏𝗙, the Canadian economist, who's written a lot about energy transitions, and he says, well, they've never happened at anything like the speed at which we need this current new energy transition to take place. They typically take the best part of a century, and we don't have the best part of a century. What makes it more complicated is the sheer scale of what we need to change. It's not just that we need to make all of today's electricity green. We're probably going to have to, by 2050, have 4 times as much electricity as today, and it's all got to be green. Why is it growing? It's growing because people in developing countries, understandably, want to have a higher quality of living. And it's also going to rise because many of the things which currently are using fossil fuels, like transport, have got to be changed over to electrification instead. And so and it's likewise in manufacturing. So there's a heck of a lot more that needs to be done by this energy transition than merely meet today's. And so there is a scenario ahead in which we think we are on course, that we congratulate ourselves for the remarkable progress which has been made. It's true, solar panels are about 1/10 of the cost they were a decade ago in some comparisons. That's remarkable. But the risk is that we will get too complacent by the apparent signs of agreement, and then it will turn out that we're nowhere near going fast enough. That we might be apparently halfway there by 2030, but the real difficulty is in doing that final scaling up. And so the risk is that we will be overtaken by events that, although the renewable energies are used much more than before, they're not being used enough, and we'll be pushed over the edge into something in which society breaks down. After all, when there was adverse climate change in the past, let's go back to 1315, 1316, 1317. By some accounts, the start of the Little Ice Age. There was, it's believed, a large volcano eruption in New Zealand, of all places, which caused 2 or 3 years of very bad harvest. Society almost broke down. There was a great rise in the number of crimes. People who normally would be looking after each other in a communitarian way were increasingly desperate, and in desperation society collapses. So the risk is that we will lose our social fabric despite our best intentions, and in the midst of these troubled times, people will make increasingly mad decisions which are not given the benefit of the true wisdom of the crowds. So I think we have a heck of a lot to do to ensure we don't go that way. We have to debug these climate transition plans, energy transition plans very thoroughly, and I'm glad we're going to be doing that.
Thank you, David. So Professor Sachs, over to you. So just drawing upon some of the comments that David has made, and perhaps, so you previously gave a talk at the LSE highlighting notions of climate justice. And one of the key takeaways I took from that talk was the notion that, I mean, in a nutshell, some of the people who presently, all other actions put aside, who are going to suffer from the adverse effects of climate change the most, are the ones who have had the least to do with contributing to our current predicament. And charting a path forward in terms of the current trajectory that we're on. Do you have specific thoughts in terms of how we need to upgrade our thinking to account for notions of climate justice and notions of the distribution of the effects of climate change within that context? I think you're on mute.
I'm still a year into this pandemic and we speak on you. So I think it's very important to do quantified analysis of what we're talking about so that we don't just tell tales, but try to understand quantitatively pace, scale, change. Then we can answer questions like, could we go so fast? We've never gone so fast. Well, we've never done this before either. So the question is what to do, how to do it, and whether it can be accomplished. I don't think energy at net zero could be accomplished in 10 years. I do believe it can be accomplished substantially in 30 years. And that's based not on pulling dates out of the air, but rather quantification of what is the lifespan of infrastructure, what is the pace of investment that can be made, where should the investments be made, and so forth. It is, in my view, a different kind of policy work. Economists spent too much time on prices because for a lot of reasons in our profession, which is a whole other story, economists love to intervene in prices, as Mr. 𝗏𝗏 taught us a century ago. But on this particular challenge, while prices play some role, quantities play an even more important role. And we need a framework that is a quantified framework that explains what can be done when. Now, that's not what you asked me, but it is on the question of can we do this by mid-century. That requires a different kind of analysis than merely historical analogies. When it comes to the question of can there be justice, the answer is yes. Will there be justice? Probably not. We don't live in a world that is tightly bound by just considerations. We live in a world of nation states and political power and powerful lobbies and a lot of neglect, a lot of scientific ignorance, and many, many other considerations, which mean that everything is messier than it is in our spreadsheets, without question. And justice is not one of the high considerations in this world. Sad to say, even though it is we were taught by the ancients that perhaps it's the most important matter for the world. It's not put in a preeminent way. I mention this because I don't think the US government pays a whit about climate justice right now, and it hasn't for 20 years. And It hasn't for 40 years, even, I could say. And I think that that's true of powerful countries. What I would add is what Juergen mentioned about the geopolitics of this change. On the whole, this transition is probably, it's geopolitically disruptive, but probably not in the same manner as the fossil fuel age, because these resources are far more distributed than the fossil fuel resources. That's a good thing. Most countries can manage to develop a lot of renewable energy on their own soil. This is, broadly speaking, more democratizing in terms of energy resources. And it happens to be favorable to some of the poorest places in the world. The Sahel is devoid of fossil fuels nearly, but it is very rich in solar power. And this is true of a lot of semi-desert regions in the world, which are very poor in many cases, but very rich in what needs to be done. Good news. Countries like Russia, though, that's a major geopolitical adversity for Russia, without question. I'd not want to be in the Russian situation on this, and I'd not want to be in the Saudi situation on this, though even Saudi Arabia has massive solar power that it can tap and actually is beginning to do so. On the question of what to do about poor countries that are hit hard by the actual climate change, I'll just make one very basic point. The scale of the harms compared to the size of the world economy and world wealth is huge for these poor countries and small for the world. So if we care to address in a just way the harms, we are not blocked by doing so by impossibly large burdens. In other words, to put it another way, if we cared to address the very severe difficulties that island states are facing, or that drought-ridden or hard-hit, flooded lowland economies in the tropics and subtropics are experiencing, this can be done with 1% of world output or less. In other words, if we try, we can do this justly. And we should do this justly. My argument at LSE was we can quantify historical responsibility. We can quantify damages. They are absolutely different, as you mentioned. And so we can create essentially a trust fund for financing losses or financing the insurance premia that attend to the risk of losses. And we should do that. And as academics, we should make such proposals and we should promote the ideas of justice. Most politicians are miserable, in my view. Let me just put that on the table. Their incentives are wrong and they are not properly trained. And the world is not a world of philosopher kings, as Plato actually rightly called for. So we have work to do in this, but I think academics have a way and a responsibility to put forward just transition plans and just management of this, and it is within reach.
Just to follow up on that, Professor Sachs, so within the context that you've just mentioned, broadly, completely agree. I think most nation states act from a realist perspective, from a self-interested perspective. One of the things you have mentioned in the past, though, is this notion that our methods of thinking, particularly economics, but also politics, etc., views nature as being separate from ourselves and does not integrate it within that context. And as the normative the norms of dealing with climate change shift, do you see that kind of intellectual framework shifting alongside it, and what the relationship between the two are?
I think that the most important shift in mindset that we need is of a global society. And we are on a something of a historic course on that, but with the terrible accidents along the way, we did not have in Western civilization. Maybe the first idea of global civilization was Isaiah the prophet around 4th century BC, but we didn't operationalize the idea of global governance until Bentham actually started to talk about global institutions, and Kant talked about perpetual peace in 1794. Since then, we had the League of Nations and its failure. We have the United Nations and its fragility, but I would say partial success. We have what I regard as absolutely crucial, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as a moral charter that we should build upon in the 21st century. But we don't have strongly effective international institutions to this date, even though we are utterly interconnected. And we don't have fiscal transfers and a mechanism for directing resources across border in a systematic way. Even the European Union nearly falls into a faint if the redistribution is more than 1% of GDP of the European Union. Then it's almost a calamity to talk about cross-border transfers. This is archaic and it's dangerous because we don't address sustainable development needs, because we don't direct resources across national boundaries in an appropriate way other than through private capital, which is something quite different from what we're talking about. And so in this way, it is our global institutions that I think are the most important building blocks for the challenges that we want to address in the 21st century. To build that building block by nationally elected or selected or self-selected politicians is very tough, because none of them responds to a global constituency per se. And this is why the UN or the League of Nations emerged only after catastrophe. And that is our fragility. We need to avoid the catastrophe. And I think just to mention what David Wood was saying, the biggest potential catastrophe on this planet remains nuclear war, without question. This is the existential threat, I believe, that remains with us, because we have nuclear weapons that can end the planet in the hands of psychopaths like Donald Trump and others. And this is what we should be also attending to. But I don't want to digress. I just want to say what we really need is international institutions that work, and crucially, that can direct financial resources to public goods across boundaries. If we have that, we're going to make a lot of advance in justice, in meeting unmet needs, and in being able to carry out these pathways that on paper are feasible, but politically can easily be blocked.
100%. Thank you for that, Professor Sachs. Juergen, so from transitioning from the cheery topic of nuclear weapons to energy markets, within the context of what we're discussing, nation states and indeed private actors being self-interested actors, what do you see as being the potential redistribution of interests coming out of the transition of energy markets? Do you see any kind of potential for synergies? Are we going to see a shift in geopolitics? And what does that look like in terms of progress to be made on climate change?
Okay, so before I answer the question on the sort of stakeholder engagement, what you just highlighted, I just want to respond to Professor Sachs. I fully agree with him on having sort of a differentiated picture in terms of geopolitics and the energy transition. I also fully agree with the democratizing effect, and also in terms of democratizing of access, and also in terms of democratizing the possibility to develop for, especially for countries or regions with no conventional electricity infrastructure. So that could be a blessing. However, I also want to bring in the potential of a resource curse when specifically, for instance, let's look at rare earth mining, where some of these substances like cobalt and so on is highly geographically concentrated. And when these countries are now confronted with massive revenue income streams, that could be also, it could go in both ways. It could provide resources to regimes which are not follow humanitarian practices as other countries, or it could also, depending on the institutional preconditions, like if you have weak institutions there, it could also create redistribution conflicts of actors that want to have access, or they want to control these resources. So coming back to your question and answering it, and so when we look at how stakeholder engagement, and I refer to interstate relations, shape the way how energy transformations taking place. It's just for simplicity, let's just look at 3 potential world orders. Let's assume a world order which resembles much of the world order we have seen the last 70 years, which we can call, apart from a few years, a liberal international order, with the United States deciding and committed to defend this order. We would see a market, or a market-based transition, bottom up. We see open markets, innovation driving it, consumer preferences, digitization. We'll see greater energy efficiency, much greater deployment of renewables, but we still see a significant role for oil and gas, and also coal, because of the cost competitiveness in some region over the next decades. By contrast, if we go to the other if we go to an extreme, if we can get this act together, and with unprecedented cooperation and coordination and determination among states and among all the actors in civil society, then we could see we could speak from a top-down energy transition, when we just look at the states at this moment, which is driven by governments, driven by policies and predetermined mandates and targets. And here I see the greatest role for renewables. And then let's look at the third outcome, which is a third potential world order, which is a mix between the first and the second, of course, and to get the magic 3. It's a multipolar world, which is fragmented, nationalistic approaches, less international cooperation, and inward-looking policies, and overall lower growth. So this would imply a quite a different sort of framework where the energy transition evolves. However, we should also look at the flip side in terms of the way the energy transition affects the stakeholders and affects interstate relations. So a government-driven transition, a top-down transition, would be or could be the best scenario for China, because if there are predetermined long-term goals, you need technology, you need capital, you need infrastructure, and China at this moment is best positioned to provide this. And with this, it comes also enormous political influence. And this scenario would also sort of, in this scenario, we will see less focus on like global energy trade and more focus on regional markets. So this meaning that geography is actually becoming more important. So it matters more who your neighbor is. And with the electrification of supergrids, and this also involves, like, of course, also risks to what we have talked before in the new systems integration, cybersecurity, privacy challenges, and so on. I don't want to go into depth into this. And a market-driven transition might be paradoxically best, or sort of you might not expect, but I believe specifically Middle Eastern countries and GCC countries might be beneficiaries of a more market-driven transition. Although a market-driven transition, we still see a diminished role for oil and fossil fuels, but we will see that countries which are able to produce oil, for which will be still a demand there, those that are most cost competitive will knock out high-cost oil producers, which are mainly located in the West. This doesn't mean that it will affect their revenues because of lower oil prices, but in terms of market shares and in terms of political power, it could be even I would say it could look different than often. The picture could look a bit different than often assumed. So it's my response to your question.
So just to follow up on this,
yeah.
Juergen, so if I can frame this between the perspective of a unilateral and a kind of multilateral problem, for certain, let's say certain countries in the global south, and indeed for China and certain other up and coming powers, there seems to me, and feel free to challenge me on this, but it seems to me that there is a more direct nexus between using fossil fuels to drive development versus using or investing in renewable or more green-based energy sources. And the incentives for them to use, the incentives for them to engage in use of such fuels remains at a higher level than, let's say, the global north. And do you see this as being, number one, is that a fair assessment from a geopolitical standpoint of influence? And number two, does this represent a substantive marker, blocker even, to making progress in transitioning to this new energy market?
So if I understood rightly, sure. in terms of, you mentioned that the South, because I had an internet connection problem.
Oh, sorry. So I can rephrase.
Sorry.
I can rephrase the question.
So,
I mean,
thank you.
The basic question. So if we take the perspective of China, it seems to me that from just a unilateral, from a self-interested point of view, it makes sense for China to continue to burn fossil fuels in driving development, in driving global influence within the international stage, and then turning to the problem of if we leave aside, I mean, if we take a loose view in terms of the urgency of the problem, which it seems some countries are, it seems to me that there isn't the same nexus between using alternate energy sources to drive development as there is with fossil fuels. And it seems to me that that is somewhat of a strategic blocker to making progress in this transition to the new energy economy. Is that a fair assessment? And any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, to use a medical term, it looks sort of schizophrenic to see sort of the coastline of the eastern part of China becoming greener and greener, or in terms of more less carbon intensive and more gas. And on the east, the more you drive inwards to the west or east-west, the more coal plants you see, and they're still developing it. And also there's not in terms of whether there's a green belt one road, whether this takes place, it's also questionable. So you see sort of that this sort of reflects the domestic politics and the struggles within China. So in terms of you have all this coal power plants and the other industries involved, stakeholders, jobs, and local governments, which have a sort of incentive or lock in to this existing energy legacies. And you see this around, like if you go to Europe, you also see these variations. If you go eastwards versus westwards, you see these differences. And also in the United States, you see urban centers, like again, East Coast and also West Coast, the edges, very different attitude to this. So it's, I fully agree with, and this sort of schizophrenic picture makes a bit, raises the question what you just raised about the commitments.
Sure. Going over to you, Piera. So I'd like to shift a little bit from the global stage to something that you reflect in your research, and generally in terms of the topic of technology as implementing a solution to climate change. I think most of the time when we talk about technological solutions to climate change, we view them as being inherently global in some respect. That if we can crack direct air carbon capture, if we can crack X, Y, and Z, it would provide a solution for the globe as a whole, within the context of this global community that Professor Sachs was alluding to. To what extent, and feel free to ground this in specific examples of technological solutions, but to what extent are these technologies inherently require political and local solutions in implementing them?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, let me just go back to this issue related to the geopolitical of renewable energy and of any technology. Which is related to this. I think it's very important to mention the fact that any of these solutions, renewable, BECCS, DAC, or whatever, have a lot of side effects and bring trade-off and issues that we need to account for, and we need to be very transparent on that. So, for instance, as the speakers mentioned before, with regards to the critical raw material that we need for renewable energy, cobalt is very much concentrated in Congo, where we have issue with child labor. So yes, we can push renewable energy, but we're going to have other unintended consequences. And another example could be, for instance, hydrogen, which is really getting momentum now. It seems as one of the solutions, especially in Europe, for decarbonizing our transport system and our electricity system. But we don't have enough iridium. Like it seems like the one of the technology that is needed for producing hydrogen, which is PEM electrolyzers, require a lot of iridium, and we don't have enough. So I think we need to be extremely careful and very much transparent in trying to identify the silver bullets. And this brings me again to this greenhouse gas removal technology, which are quite different compared to, for instance, renewable energy, because they are very large scale. So they require huge investments and collaboration between private investors and government and so on in order to become feasible. And the supply chain also of this technology is very different. So If we take, for example, 𝗏𝗃 as an example, so 𝗏𝗃 it works by burning biomass, which is then sequestrated through carbon capture and storage, and then it's burning in the ground. So it basically allows you to reach negative emission. And of course, there are countries such as, for instance, Brazil, which would be advocated for growing this biomass, perhaps in a sustainable way, hopefully. And then other countries, which are the ones that pollute more and would require to offset more emission, could use that biomass. And then perhaps if the geological storage is then available in those countries, can then sequestrate these emissions. So we do need, so the supply chain, the scale is it's very big, and the supply chain is very extended. So this is why I think the key, one of the key words is really transparency in quantifying the side effect, the trade-off, and the opportunities, because there are going to be opportunities, but we need to be quite clear on that. So if, for example, we take the example of the Biden administration and the fact that renewable energy, for instance, are going to be promoted, especially because of employment creation and employment opportunities, which is one of the arguments that has been used quite a lot by the US administration. We need to make sure also that we know where these renewable energy are manufactured, which is mostly in China, which means that the real value, social value that's deploying renewable is not really going to be for the domestic labor markets, but rather is going to be offshore. So yeah, this is, I don't know if I answer your question.
I think it lays, no, that lays the groundwork very much so, in that, which was the point I was alluding to. I think there's not enough discussion around technological solutions from a social sciences perspective in terms of what the opportunity costs are. Even if the technology is cracked, good ideas don't sell themselves, they don't implement themselves. Within that context, though, are there particular technologies or particular approaches that you find quite, that you think hold a lot of promise or particularly attractive to you?
Well, I mean, I wish, I know, but no, I think we would need all of them. And again, yeah. I think that each region will most probably, each country or each region will most probably push the most, hopefully the most suitable one. Sure. Yeah. I think that, for instance, if you look at climate models, and if you look at these pathways that we were talking before, they rely very much on 𝗏𝗃s. And this is because 𗗏𝗃s have the advantage also of producing energy. So it's not only removing carbon, but it's also providing a service, for instance. Sure. There are other solutions that perhaps...
Could you just clarify that? So it relies quite a lot on 𗗏𝗃s?
Yeah, so these pathways that we mentioned before to reach net zero, there are the one that's the IPCC and all of these targets rely on. They also rely, in terms of technologies, they rely very much on 𗗏𝗃s. One of the reasons is also that 𗗏𝗃s is producing electricity as a service, and therefore it allows also to provide a service in terms of
absolutely. Could you just define that for some people who may not know what it is? Your reference to 𗗏𝗃s.
𗗏𝗃s.
Yep.
Yeah. So 𗗏𝗃s is a technology that burns biomass. And by combusting the biomass produce electricity and sometimes also heat. And by combining this bioenergy plant with carbon capture and storage, you are able to sequestrate the carbon from the fuel gases and remove it from the atmosphere by compress then the CO2 and store it in geological sites.
Yep.
And so this one is one of the prominent technology, but of course there are many more others that might have also lower side effects, because one of the issue of bioenergy deployed, BECCS deployed at scale, is the of course the adverse consequence for land use and the competition with food production. Some other small technology, like for instance biochar, could be deployed at local scale and could be maybe more suitable for developing countries or for tropic region, because the carbon is sequestrated in the ground, in the soil, rather than be stored in a geological site. So there are a lot of them, and a lot of scientists that now are working on them. And I think most importantly, and this maybe is a very positive message now, both the UK government and Europe are starting designing certification for making sure that this can be a solution that really remove carbon, and also that are then certified and financed and encouraged.
Sure. Absolutely. Sticking with the topic of technology, David, same question to you. Are there particular technological solutions or approaches that that you view as particularly promising? And also, how do you view the role of technological solutions within the wider context of what we're discussing? Multi-stakeholder engagement, self-interested parties spread across the globe, and the potential to deliver an impact in relation to the effects of climate change.
If we get the technologies right, it can be a total game changer. But we need to cast our net quite wide. Imagine if we were having a discussion 9-10 months ago. Should we pick one vaccine and put all our money behind developing, I don't know, the Sanofi vaccine? Or should we go in for this weird thing called mRNA vaccines? Oh, that's a bit too unlikely. Let's not invest in that. It turns out that the global community did experimentation on lots of different vaccines, and some failed and some succeeded. And it would have been hard in advance to know for sure which would succeed. After all, some of the largest companies didn't succeed. So it's the same with technologies. And I'd like to put on the table the possibilities of nuclear technology. And I know that's a controversial point, but just as we should be aiming for greater transparency in the discussion, making clear what the engineering difficulties and the social difficulties, and also the upsides are of various technologies, we must have rational discussions about nuclear too. And unfortunately, a lot of the discussion about nuclear has been hijacked by emotions, which are understandable. But if we look at what's possible in terms of next generation nuclear solutions, smaller systems being developed by the likes of TerraPower, with backing by Bill Gates and others, the possibility is that this will use existing nuclear fuel from other reactors and can be placed inside these new reactors. And it will also avoid any risk of meltdown by design. And this was made possible, it hasn't happened yet, and we can talk about that shortly, but this was made possible by taking advantage of another technology, which is supercomputers. And a lot of the design principles of these next generation nuclear reactors have been modeled much more extensively inside realistic simulations, rather than having to go through the lengthy task of engineering real instances in each case. So it's still some way to go, but I think we should be looking at that, and we should not be too deflected by just the undoubted tragedies of Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, and most especially Chernobyl. So that's one thing I would want to look at. I'd want to look also at nuclear fusion. And again, people may laugh at this because since the 1950s, the first time somebody said they'd have nuclear fusion within 20 years, the joke has been that nuclear fusion is always at least 20 years in the future. And if we look at the largest nuclear fusion project, ITER, a multinational project in the south of France, it is going pretty slowly. But with new technology and with new funding, there are lots of interesting startups on the go. They have done things differently. They're taking advantage of high temperature superconductors, whereas previous designs needed low temperature superconductors. They're using new geographies, new geometries rather, the geographies, although there's new geographies involved too, in some of their designs. And they can also use, again, artificial intelligence to help do some of the design and real-time monitoring. So I wouldn't be totally surprised if we did have nuclear fusion on tap by 20 years' time. I'm not going to say that's the only thing we should bet on, but I think it deserves some attention. So these are two technology areas. I think there's plenty more as well that deserves attention. I think there probably are other sources of wind on the planet that could be tapped, and we could ramp things up. And we also need to look at the storage of energy for intermittency, because both solar and wind have the drawbacks of being intermittent. And batteries don't scale up as much as we'd like them to. There's been lots of progress in batteries over the last 20 or 30 years, but there's no Moore's law for batteries. It's not the same scale. And so looking at other ways to store energy, such as compressed air storage underground, or such as pumping water up hills, although there may not be enough hills, and other means, other kinds of clever batteries. They all deserve a lot more financing and a lot more attention. Now, we should not rely on techno solutions. It's going to require on humans keeping in control. Lots of things will involve, as well as technological innovations, they will involve political innovations and also financial innovations. And I was very struck when Professor Sachs said earlier that the roadmap had every sign of being financiable. I just refer back to what Mark Carney said in his Reith lectures, the former governor of the Bank of England. It was noteworthy that a whole of the Reith lectures was devoted to the subject of climate change. And he said, again, that we were going to need more financial innovations. And this isn't just asking the financial industry to do a good turn, to be charitable, to be philanthropic. Actually, if these systems are organized correctly, there is a lot of good new business to be made by green funds. So I'm not an expert on green funds by any means, and I'll leave it to the others on the panel to say more about this. I just don't want to leave the impression that I'm entirely thinking that technology will solve the answer. Sure. It's got to be part of a wide spectrum of approaches, but it could be a game changer if we keep betting hard in the right, promising lines.
So just a follow-up question from my side, David, and something that taking a wider view on this, as you say, technology doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it intermingles with other factors that we need to consider as well, and possibly also drawing on something that you mentioned in your opening remarks in relation to the implementation of technological solutions from a political basis and the relative harm that could produce. How, and this is admittedly quite a broad-based question, but as a futurist, how do you see these kind of, you've outlined perhaps some of the negative side, but holistically, how do you see the increasing impact that technology is having on the popular zeitgeist, influencing politics and policy, how we talk about these things, how we view technology as a whole, and indeed, on a broader spectrum, what it means for us as a species and how we view risk?
So we've talked in this call about politicians and that sometimes they're very miserable, short-sighted, self-interested people. But I don't think that's entirely accurate about all politicians, especially when they get involved in politics in the first place. They're often idealistic. So I'd put politicians on a spectrum. There are certainly some very troubling and destructive ones. There are a few more idealistic ones, and there's a lot in the middle. And these in the middle can be influenced by the public zeitgeist. And they can be influenced by more and more people speaking up in various ways. And so some politicians will take that as a cue to maybe say something they wanted to say before, but they were a bit afraid that it might not be politically acceptable within their own party. So what we must do as a public, we must encourage bipartisan political leadership on this. We must avoid talking in such a way that we will alienate some of the main political forces. For example, in America, we need the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party to be talking very constructively and positively. So we must avoid saying things like, hey, we're not going to solve climate until we dismantle capitalism, which some people have said. And often when I speak about climate change, the questions come up, why didn't you say we need to abolish fiat currencies or abolish capitalism? And I say, no, capitalism should be part of the solution rather than just being opposed to it. So let's find the way to have a public zeitgeist which builds in a bipartisan way consensus, which will then influence more politicians. And this should be not just, hey, we can manage and it'll be a terrible sacrifice, but we can do it. This should be looking to a much more positive future when we have abundant green energy. And we know in principle how we can do it. There are just lots of issues along the way. And with abundant green energy, it won't mean that we all have a much poorer quality of life than today. We'll have, in many ways, a much better quality of life. I sometimes talk about a sustainable superabundance. And what's going to motivate people as a whole isn't just fear. It's going to be a combination of a sense of urgency, but also a sense of positive progress. So we need to paint this credible picture, and we need to be able to paint it from multiple perspectives and communicate it in multiple ways. But we're not going to bring people along if we are seen as being somehow unrealistic, nor are we going to bring people along if we're seen as being too grey. So we need to have an inspiring vision that takes into account the real obstacles en route.
Thank you very much, David. I understand, Professor Sachs, that you're pressed for time, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to make some closing remarks if you'd like to, or just generally wish us. I think you're mute again.
Oh my God. Thank you. Yes, I will have to leave, but I want to thank the panel. I do want to emphasize, we started out the discussion about the time sensitivity and the urgency and the nonlinearities. So when we think about technologies, we need to think about the real time between now and 2050, and then the real time after 2050. Fusion, for example, in my view, will not play any scaled role before 2050, though I agree with what 𝗍𝗿 said, that there is a lot of promise right now, and what the promise is, according to the physicists, is that prototypes can be built with some of the new technologies perhaps in the next 5 to 10 years, and these can be perhaps even producing commercializable models by 2035 to 2040. But then when you think about what that means for the actual role of fusion in our energy grid in 2050, it means not much. So when we do the scenarios, we have to think in terms of what we have, how things will change, and the fact that we don't want to kill ourselves by waiting for the future, because this, like Burden's ass in the philosophical puzzle, the donkey that can't decide whether to turn left to eat or to turn right to eat. We don't want to say, well, we're waiting for the perfect technology and in the meantime destroy the earth. So we have the technology pathways to get us, even with what's in hand, probably 75 to 80% of the way to where we need to go. We have on the drawing board technologies that get us to 95%. We have major puzzles, and we have major promise. For example, fusion could be the decisive energy source for much of the world in 2070. Perfectly possible. But let us not postpone the actions that are needed right now, because we have photovoltaics, we have on and offshore wind, we have hydropower in many places, we have other energy sources, we have a nuclear fleet, we have other things now, and that's where we have to move. I also do want to say, in all of the areas where there are problems, it's good to be proactive in the sense that, consider cobalt, for example. It is too pessimistic to say, well, cobalt is in the Congo and they have child labor. Cobalt is actually the most promising possibility for DRC's development in the history since King Leopold raped the country 140 years ago. In other words, we should view this as a positive development, that a crucial mineral in an impoverished country that has been so badly misused by Western powers over a century and a half could play a constructive role. More than that, it happens that Congo also has vast, untapped, financeable hydropower. on the Congo Basin that could be a game changer for hundreds of millions of people in Central Africa. So then we need a constructive approach. There's no reason why cobalt should be mined by child labor, but the cobalt could finance schools for those children. That would be a nice thing to do. And we should not think in static terms. We should think in solution terms. And I'm excited about the fact that, thanks God, after that country was ravaged by Western powers, after the CIA put a bullet in the head of Lumumba, after the CIA installed Mobutu, after so much damage to that country, why don't we help Central Africa to develop in a sustainable way? And thank goodness there is a mineral that is important that could be sustainably developed in a way that would be constructive for the country. So I just want to turn the mindset from the problem to the problem solving, because there's absolutely no reason anywhere in the world why children should not be in school and why they should be working in mines, for God's sake. And with a little care, that's not a controversial issue. That is a solvable problem, a practically solvable problem. So I want us to be constructive at each step, because by 2050, we need to be at net zero. And let's keep our eye on the ball, and let's keep our eye on human rights, and let's keep our eye on constructive solutions. But thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. I'm really grateful.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. A very holistically optimistic note to leave on. So thank you very much for your participation.
Bye-bye, everybody, and thanks to the fellow panelists.
Thank you. Great. I think we've had quite a few questions come in, so we're going to turn to Q&A now. And the first question is actually for you, Piera, which is, does work on negative emissions and adaptation technologies take away attention from preventative measures?
Yeah, well, I think this is the famous moral hazards issue, which is related to the fact that generally negative emission technology, especially CCS, is seen as an excuse to delay mitigation, because we know that at one point we can start simply removing CO2 from the atmosphere. I think that this argument was valid perhaps 5 years ago, until 5 years ago, when we didn't really know that negative emission technology would need to be deployed in any case. And the reason is that there are unavoidable emissions coming from the way we produce things. So from the chemical industries, from the cement, the iron and steel, that are still gonna be there. And so the math is telling us that we don't get to net zero without them. And we need, as Professor Sachs was saying, we need to start deploying them now. What we need is to make sure that we take care again of the side effect, we acknowledge the side effect, and we have a transparent framework to quantify this effect. But negative emission technology are a suite of technology. It's not only one, there are many of them. There is enhanced weathering, there is biochar, there is agroforestry practice, direct air capture. So this is what we need also to communicate as academic to the public, because one of the reasons, I think, for which CCS is not deployed and renewable, which are absolutely part of the solution, are so much promoted, is because renewable are just more sexy than not CCS, which is basically a way for which we capture carbon. We have a big pipeline of CO2, which then we store underground. And so the way we communicate this and the way we address this is very important, especially for the public, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you, Piera. Next question, which I think alludes to something that you were drawing on, David. And just Piera and Juergen, I'm probably going to place these questions to one of you, but the panel as a whole, if you wish to comment, please feel free, and we can enter an open discussion. But Scott Solomon from Columbia University asks, how can we generate the taxation revenue necessary to push forward programs that work on emissions reductions, such as those offered by the Green New Deal in the US? Is a wealth tax on corporations and wealthy individuals necessary? Yeah, that's so I think that's something you were commenting on earlier, Dave.
So we should look at multiple ways to ensure that these initiatives have adequate funding. They probably need a heck of a lot more funding than they've got already. So how can we ensure that money is directed in these ways? And we can do it by forcing people, or we can do it by incentivizing people. And I think incentivizing is probably needs to be considered as well. And if we can pursue something which is called, let me get the name right, TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. I think this is an important initiative. Hopefully at COP26 this year in November in Glasgow, more countries will agree to it. And it's the way that will ensure that all financial bodies publicize the extent to which their investments are climate positive or not. And many companies don't even know. And the point is to make it clear what's here and what's not there. And then government should also, I think, be assisting people to invest or divert some of their money into these climate positive ways. And so this is some financial engineering, restructuring of some of the green funds. And I think that is important. But we should be looking in multiple ways too. I am in favor, and I was sort of surprised that nobody on this panel at the LSE has advocated it so far. I am a fan of a carbon tax. I think Professor Sachs said we tried it and it hadn't really worked. I think it has worked to some extent locally. It hasn't been applied enough yet for various reasons. I think it's an excellent thing to do. It can be made revenue neutral for a while, so that the money raised by carbon taxes in part could be returned to the people who are most affected by it. So we should look at that too. To address the actual question about wealth tax, and I think there's a lot of scope for wealth tax. There's certainly scope for tightening and monitoring existing tax systems to avoid the evasions which go on. Many of the largest companies in the world are very skilled at avoiding paying taxes by finding legal loopholes, so they are still behaving legally, if not ethically. So the countries of the world should be much more vigilant at closing these tax loopholes. But I think there's probably scope for having larger corporation tax and occasionally a wealth tax as well. Although there are difficulties too, as is well known, because a lot of people's wealth is tied up in things which cannot easily be turned into cash quickly. So I'm all in favor of looking at it. I don't think it is a single silver bullet, but I do want to find ways to ensure that many projects, including negative emissions technologies, which I fully support as well as these other energy initiatives, they need a heck of a lot more funding than they've got already. And by the way, if they do get more funding, it's possible they will deliver things much faster than has historically been possible. Professor Sachs, in his final remarks, mentioned on fusion that it seemed that it wouldn't be possible commercially until 2070. Well, I look at what we did with vaccines in the COVID crisis. A year ago, most people were saying, oh, it's going to take 2 or 3 years before we got vaccines. Well, people really knuckled down. We saw it as a shared social imperative to address this. And as a result, we've got vaccines faster, and that are more successful, more effective than many of us dared to hope going back. So I think with the right public and private funding, many of these initiatives could go faster, and I think they actually need to go faster as well, to be frank.
Just to follow up on that, David, and perhaps Juergen, you could comment on this as well. What's your appraisal of the European Green Deal in terms of the, so just to clarify for everyone, the extent of the financial mandate of the Green New Deal is both a mix of public and private, public spending and private incentives to engage within this technology. In terms of the, well, in terms of the perhaps the details of the deal, it seems like a stake in the ground to build towards technologically and policy-wise. But in terms of the intentions behind it, the target set, etc., and indeed, Piera, if you want to comment on this as well, what are your thoughts on that generally?
I'll leave the others to comment in detail. I think it is a good stake in the ground. It's not enough, but you got to start. And politics is the art of the possible. So you do what's feasible. The commitments that were made in Paris are by no means sufficient, but again, it's a start, and it's putting a framework in place which can be evolved over time. So broadly, I support what's in there. I can't speak to the details, but I hope some of my fellow panelists can address that.
Juergen, would you like, perhaps not, I mean, yeah, go.
Yeah, so to the question of financing, which has been sort of prominent in the last sort of half of our debate, I personally I think that it's not the issue of lack of finance. Like there's enough money around us floating, so it's about how to channel this money into the right projects, into green infrastructure rather than brown infrastructure. And as David rightly said, it's about incentives. And as we know, in public finance, like they have a variety of tools available in terms of you need to get the money from somewhere. And taxation is one of these tools. And then you also can raise debt, and green bonds is a big theme also across the globe in terms of investing into raising debt, which is dedicated for low carbon energy projects and also low carbon projects in other areas. So I think that there is massive potential for this, and it has the green bond market has seen tremendous growth, and up to the pandemic, and the whole COVID pandemic was it still you could see it as the glass half full or half empty, in terms of many see it as an opportunity now to green the recovery programs and sort of lock in a low carbon energy transition into the stimulus of different countries. And here you rightly said the Green Deal. It's one of these comprehensive responses, long-term responses to COVID, and also much more beyond in terms of locking in incentives for the future. It's about the comprehensive economic transformation, because it involves so many different sectors. And when you have these very comprehensive plans, it's also always sort of when you change on one side of when you change a policy tool on one side of the spectrum, there might be consequences or unintended consequences on another side. And this brings me to the whole issue of, for example, a carbon border adjustment tax, which has been also sort of raised in the European Union's thinking of sort of using such a carbon border adjustment tax to address the issue of carbon leakage. So what is carbon leakage? It's simply if you're a steel producer and it's much cheaper for you in terms of environmental standards and so on to produce your steel in a factory somewhere in Asia, in China, where the environmental standards are lower, and it's cheaper for you to produce it there and import the steel to Europe. So the carbon border adjustment tax is a means, or is an idea in terms of to stop this carbon leakage. So if you want to buy steel, that the steel import from China is at the same level, of the same playing field as the domestically produced steel, which has much higher sort of regulations and standards. So it's sort of making paying for the additional carbon for imports. However, this raises the issue of okay, of competitiveness, and in terms, is it a welfare tax on the general population, because you taxing something that the consumer also must pay in the end. In Europe, the products would be more expensive. So it's still it's still a highly debated issue about the welfare consequences of taxes, whether it's good or bad. And this still needs to be resolved, or this needs to be resolved in the political arena. And here again, we have different actors with different incentives and different institutions that struggling these fights. And with regard to the issue of money and financing, I think it's very exciting in terms of to hear financial firms and financial investors and so on. Sort of, it seems, at least on the surface, they have accepted that this is an issue, and they realize they need to go or to address this for over the long run. And what David said, it's very important, this disclosure carbon projects, in terms of really make it transparent, the firms where you invest in the long run. And here also plays in the issue of regulation of the state, of the central banks, to regulate, or to incentive, not even incentivize, but in terms of addressing carbon risks in their investment portfolio. I think that creates a new reality, which, and this is important, it needs to be cheap. It needs to be financially more attractive to invest in green than in brown assets. And especially long-term investors like pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, which taking a long-term perspective in investments like a 30 years horizon, they have already started divesting from certain assets like oil sands and so on, which are not viable over this long run, and they are also often therefore named as a sort of stranded assets.
Sure.
Which
I'm just gonna there's a couple more questions that lead to some of these topics as well, Juergen, so we're going to come to them, but
okay.
there's one question in particular, Piera, in terms of the comment made by Professor Sachs in relation to the DLC and 𝗏𝗿. I saw you nodding in relation to you know, the notion being that the kind of political situation in the DLC means mining of 𝗏𝗿 may be precarious. Did you have any follow-up comments in relation to that, or just generally opinions in relation to the comments?
Yeah, I mean, so my comment with regard to that is that, well, first of all, I've just recently started reading about critical raw material and how important they're actually for the energy transition. And I think what Professor Sachs was saying about child labor and the fact that we need to really be careful on how these materials are being mined and where they're coming from, it's very important, because it's the burden is on us. And another important point, I think it's on recycling, which is a very important topic, especially for the mining industry, because especially because it starts becoming clear that we are not going to have enough critical raw material for many of the technologies that we will need. Recycling and advancing mining is going to help us to address these issues, especially in those countries, because there is a lot of opportunities for waste remediation and recycling of this material. And on waste, then maybe I can perhaps bridge on what you were discussing about financing these technologies and financing low carbon technology. I think that we need to see especially in the field of negative emission technology, we need to see the removal as a waste, a public good. If we see it in this way, we are going to be more proactive and more willing to use, for instance, carbon taxes as a revenue recycling mechanism that then can finance those technology, because it's a waste remediation activity. So this is my 2 sentences of that.
We've briefly lost our moderator. Maybe I can say something more about the busting of the carbon asset bubble, because you already mentioned, Juergen and Piera, the fact that many of the pension systems, for example, they have a fiduciary duty to think long term. Many other politicians and businesses just think short term, but the large amounts of money in pension funds are legally obliged to think long term. And the current valuation of many of these fossil fuel companies is about 4 times as high as it could be if you take into account how much carbon can actually be burnt over the next 30 years. So they are sky-high valuations, assume that their declared resources can all be burnt. And if that happens, then we're on the trajectory to 5 or 6 degrees of warming. If we commit to just 2 degrees of warming, which is already beyond Paris, then these reserves, only a quarter of them roughly can be burnt. And once people realize this is going to be the case, there's going to be a steady flow of sensible long-term finance away from these companies, and there is going to be the busting of a bubble. It's going to be a major financial implication, in fact, and wise investors are going to anticipate that and start moving out ahead of times. So that is another scenario which will help to accelerate the application of money. It won't disappear. It should be put instead into these green funds.
Apologies to the panel, I don't know what happened there, but it seems like fruitful grounds for discussion in my absence. Leading on to, I think, discussion points around financial markets that David was just commenting on. Zach Smith is asking, how can coordination problems integral to climate change be solved without a supranational enforcement mechanism? And I think this is a fair question in that, and I think it would be interesting to perhaps build a little bit on what David has commented on in terms of analogies between technological innovation and implementation coming out of the COVID crisis and the successes and failures of that. So, and I think this links to what you were discussing previously, Juergen. So some of this comes from the context of free markets, but without a central authority, are there particular hopes for solutions to climate change that are the product of international or national cooperation?
Yeah, so it's very exciting to hear and to look at the prospects of the new technologies and also existing the intensification of the spread of existing technologies and their contribution to addressing the climate risks. However, again, and I bringing in again the variable of geopolitics, is we have just recently seen, and the COVID crisis has revealed the vulnerability of our global supply chains, specifically with medical products, but also in terms of critical technologies and materials. Mm-hmm. And these critical materials are key to green technology. And so what I'm talking is when we talk about these global supply chains, the global supply chains of green technologies, for instance, when we look, for instance, on lithium-ion batteries, you have a number of steps involved in the production of these batteries, starting from the downstream from the mining, then you have to refine the components, then you have manufacturing and assembly stages. And each of these stage, you have bottlenecks. You have different players which are creating risks. And during the last 20 years, we have seen the evolvement of global supply chains, meaning that countries which are most efficient in producing, of course, depending on the resource endowment where you can mine. So you will have mining sort of concentrated in countries where you can mine. Then you have, for instance, countries, because the refining stage of these critical materials and earth, it's quite the polluting exercise. You use a lot of water. So you have seen the emergence of these stages of the supply chains, specifically in China, which have a low, where it's just cheaper to do this sort of, to do these refining processes, and because they have, because of lower environmental standards. So you still have, you have critical materials, critical earths in the United States, and you, some of them are abundantly here, but it's just, it's not mined here, it's not processed because of this, partly because of cost issues, but also partly because of environmental issues.
Sure.
So you have seen, and what's happened now is, and COVID has showed this vulnerability. So if everything works well under globalization, the demand and supply and market mechanisms operating effectively, efficiently, then it's fantastic. It's highly efficient and everybody wins. But however, if you see sort of supply shocks, which can again happen at each stage, because if your battery refiner cannot refine the cannot do this his task in the supply chain, then of course the battery assembler has no battery to assemble, and it goes on. So this is the whole problem. And because now countries are aware of these risks, and everyone talking about, okay, supply chain risk, supply chain, and everybody talking about increasing the resilience in national supply chains. So meaning that instead of outsourcing these activities to countries like China and so on, we want to have a secure supply chain. We want to have control over it, because we want to have our producers not depending on other countries. Sure.
So the idea is that the localization of supply chains will lead to...
And this whole thing also will translate into the prices to some extent. So here's the question: will it happen in the past what's more efficiently, or in terms of commercially driven, or are now increasingly also non-market mechanisms in play in this whole green technology? So that's one important factor.
Absolutely. So there's a couple more questions that are similarly themed, and I just want to kind of draw them together in some respect in relation to something that David, you mentioned at the beginning, which is the continuum of the definition of what existential risk is. The distinction between existential risk and catastrophic risk remains largely academic. I'd like to draw that out a little bit, in that the Cambridge Institute for the Study of Existential Risk has a very interesting definition where they talk about existential risk in the context of systems failures. So the systems that we are used to using to maintain a certain standard of living, the severity with which those systems are disrupted leads us to a grading of what the nature of the risk is. So breaking that down a little bit, a lot of the kind of discussions have been around reducing emissions on a long-term trajectory. Is there, so this is drawing upon something that 𝗖𝗿 has mentioned. Is there, perhaps not supranationally or even nationally, but perhaps from a public consciousness perspective, is there benefit in kind of outlining what the worst case scenarios are within specific contexts of food shocks, migration risks, the threat of increased conflict, etc., on a shorter timeline and what that looks like. And what's your kind of perspective on that?
So I think it is important to highlight things that could realistically go badly wrong. The recent book by David Wallace Wells, if I remember his name, the New York Times author, who's written a lot about many things in all aspects of life that could go very badly wrong later this century, in terms of once our normal governance mechanisms break down, once they become too stretched, then suddenly we think many things we took for granted will no longer be there. And so health will generally get much worse. We wouldn't be able to distribute vaccines in the same way as we're doing now if the global institutions had stopped functioning. And we can look at, once the temperature rises, many of the agricultural parts of sub-Saharan Africa will be almost, it'll be impossible to grow much food unless we change the food that they're growing, which is an important project in its own right, the adaptation project. So I think it is important to highlight things that are credible, and unfortunately if they fall to pieces under quick scrutiny, then they're counterproductive, because people will say, oh, you've cried wolf and there was no wolf, so we're not going to pay attention. And so in the past, actually, some of the possible pandemics that almost broke out in the last 30 or 40 years, people said, oh, we've heard about pandemics, they didn't come true, therefore we're not going to be worried about any new signs of pandemics, it's just a little flu. So we've got to be wise in how we communicate it. And David Wallace Wells, although his book is a fascinating read, it has been criticized, I think, with some justification on some of his exaggerations. Michael Mann's book, by the way, does an excellent job. He has a whole chapter on what he calls climate doomism. I think we should take the bad scenarios seriously, but we've got to take them seriously rather than just for despair. In terms of the question about the systems health and what 𝗖𝗹𝗶𝗃𝗶𝗺, the Cambridge the Center for Study of Existential Risks, I think we should be focusing on the health of our systems, and we should be focusing on the health of our international systems. And I think the earlier question on will we need some kind of a strong supranational enforcement is a very important one. It probably deserves a longer answer than we can really give it now. And I think we have two answers to that. One is, we shouldn't just be thinking, hey, these other countries are going to free ride and cheat, and they're going to be able to keep on emitting when we're tightening our own belts. We should look at it more positively. If we learn how to tighten our own belts, if we develop these solutions and technologies, we will be at an economic advantage, because then we will have developed this technology, which we can then share with the rest of the world for global benefit, but also for some financial benefit. So that's one way to look at things. But in the end, there are things that do need global coordination, but they don't need a single sovereign global government. We shouldn't think like that. We should think in terms of institutions that are fit for purpose. And we could look at many positive examples. I'll just got time to mention one, which is the body that oversees chemical weapons. Controlling chemical weapons goes back 150 years, when the first attempts were made and failed, But we do now have a more robust mechanism in place, which allows independent inspection of chemical sites around the world where there is any suggestion that there might be some materials being set aside for military purpose. And some of these inspections are scheduled, but there's also allowed, and all countries in the world who signed up for this scheme, including all the superpowers, have signed into it, that there can be these inspections. Why have countries bought into it? Because they all see it is in their own collective interest to avoid having wars involving terrible chemical weapons. So we can have that mechanism without there being a single world government, and we need similar mechanisms, possibly an extension of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which already implements some rules on trade. So possibly that can be revived, although it's stuck in its own inertia, so it's a difficult task. But that's one mechanism that could be improved to ensure that there is some independent monitoring of what's going on worldwide.
Fantastic. Just a follow-up question from my side, David. In terms of, I think in terms of technologies to reduce the effects of climate change, we've alluded to that a little bit. What's your thinking in terms of leveraging, let's say, high computing power that could come out of quantum computing or leveraging AI in terms of a diagnostics perspective on the planet to preempt what the impacts could be from computational modeling or otherwise. Have you seen the examples of, indeed, do you think there could be examples of technologies in that space that allow us to preempt and react to those impacts?
Exactly. This is the mission statement of DeepMind, the group in Google. Started off in London at UCL. Their mission statement is 1, solve intelligence, 2, use intelligence to solve all the other major problems. And they often mention climate change and beneficial sharing, an economy that's effective and fair as 2 as the possible things they're going to use their intelligence to solve. And this may seem like a pipe dream, but bear in mind that what DeepMind have done has shocked people several times. Their approaches in calculating how proteins will fold. It hasn't completely solved that problem, but it did a lot more recently than most people had expected. It's a very difficult problem figuring out when you specify a chemical, what's 3-dimensional structure is it going to fold up into. So they made rapid progress there. Now we have to be careful because it's always possible that computation works at a certain level and then fails when you scale it up further.
Cool.
So we shouldn't be putting any blind trust in any such AI. And here I'm anticipating, I guess, the discussion of the third panel, but it could help. And I mentioned that in the company TerraPower, one reason why Bill Gates, the company that Bill Gates funds, and looking at next generation nuclear designs, one reason I think they've made faster progress is that they've used lots of complicated AI modeling. I'm not sure AI is exactly the right word, complex software modeling, at least, let's say, with some AI to figure out in advance how the designs could really be completely fail-safe and hyper-effective and efficient. So it's part of the solution.
Fantastic. I'm just conscious that we're just coming up to the hour now, so I'd like to give all our panelists just a chance to make some closing remarks, and then I think I'm going to hand back to Joseph. So, Juergen, would you like to just some closing remarks from your side? Then we'll go to Piera and finally David. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Okay. So I personally want to say something to something concrete, because much of what I have said today is on a very high level in terms of geopolitics. So I want to go back to sort of the more tangible world. What I think, in order to persuade the public and of the dangers of climate change, I think we need to break it down into concrete examples, in terms of we need to show how we need to tell the people, how does the climate change affect the weather? What could happen to the UK if the Gulf Stream shuts down? And by explaining that the Gulf Stream brings warm water to the north, and it sort of regulates the climate in Europe to a moderate degree. And without that, it would be very cold in London. And furthermore, with climate change affecting also other ecosystems, we could see a rising water level. So to see by 2050, for instance, we could see embankment, or we would not be able to send our kids to King's College because it's underwater. And LSE is much higher. So sorry, I had to say this as a LSE alumni. But so I think with concrete examples and bring it closer to the people, I think that's also something important which we should not lose oversight.
Sure. Can I just say to any colleagues of ours from King's, we're trying to engage in a discussion to prevent the effects of climate change so that neither LSE nor King's ends up underwater. But point taken, Jakob. Piera, over to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd like just to maybe to finish with a positive message. I think I think there is a big challenge ahead, but there are also a lot of interesting opportunities for doing things more fairly and in an equitable way. I see the value on informing the public and to engage with the local communities, but I see the value more at the present rather than the future. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I think that by default, we are short-sighted, and all economic models and all the tools that we're using are telling us that we just not make rational decisions, and we tend to discount future, and we give much more value at the present. And therefore, we should focus on using all of the information that we have now, social media, all the access to the reality that we have to inform the public of what is happening right now, which is already quite severe. And perhaps also help understand the people that if we act now, then the losses and the consequences are going to be lower than just, move all of us to Mars by 2050. Absolutely. So that's.
Thank you, Piera. And last, but certainly not least, David, over to you to round us up.
So what we've heard today is that there are very significant problems facing us, but there are a whole host of parts of solutions. If we truly focus ourselves globally on these solutions, we will be able to head off the risk of climate change, and we'll be able to manage the evolution of humanity into a new age, which will be an age effectively of abundance. But to get there, we have to change climate change from being an occasional top priority of politicians to being an ongoing top priority, something that is regularly focused. A little bit like, the COVID has been the top priority for the last year, and every few days the politicians have been making public statements about it. We need a sort of similar increase in political sentiment, and that will come in part from people painting a vivid picture of how we can change and a vivid picture of what could go wrong. And so I just look at one example very briefly in the last minute or two, one example where a collision course was averted. If I go back to the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was president of America and Mikhail Gorbachev was president of the Soviet Union, these two both came from a long heritage of fearing and being highly competitive with the other side. Ronald Reagan spoke about an evil empire. Gorbachev inherited 64 years of viewing capitalism as a mortal foe. And the stakes were getting higher, and there was quite a lot of planning of nuclear war on both sides. Ronald Reagan was ramping up what some people called Star Wars and other people called the Strategic Defense Initiative. What changed was the work of a public communicator called Carl Sagan, who was an expert scientist. He was an atmospheric scientist. He had studied climate change on Mars and on Venus in his earlier days in science. And he, along with some colleagues, worked out that if there was even a limited exchange of nuclear weapons, it wouldn't cause the world to end in heat. It would likely cause the world to end in a nuclear winter. So in the early 1980s, this was developed, and Sagan was an excellent communicator. He actually changed the course of history by persuading people around Reagan and around Gorbachev to take this threat more seriously and make them realize this had to be an even higher priority, avoiding a nuclear threat. And so as a result of this, and because of the outstanding actions of these two remarkable political leaders, we managed to pull back at that stage from a threat of ongoing nuclear devastation. The strategic arms reduction talks took place. The intermediate range nuclear weapons were taken out of Europe pretty soon afterwards, and Star Wars was defunded. So with the right communications, if we can be more like Carl Sagan in the right way today, we can get today's political leaders around the world, even though they may be mortal foes, even though there's a terrible geotension, we can get them to put this as a much higher priority than before, and we can head forwards to, as I said, sustainable superabundance.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much to Juergen and Piera, and to our esteemed panel. In summary, folks, we've avoided disaster before. We can do it again. And over to you, Joseph. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. Actually, thank you to all the panelists for what was a thoroughly interesting discussion and actually a surprisingly hopeful discussion on this topic of that greatest threat to our entire species. Next up, everyone, at 1 o'clock, we'll be looking at the future pandemics in light of COVID-19. This is perhaps the threat that is most prevalent in the public consciousness at the moment. But we'll be inviting 3 speakers, that is Baroness Dido Harding, Head of Track and Trace, Professor Sir Neil Ferguson, who wrote that infamous report that led to the first lockdown in the UK, and as well as Professor Andrew Pollard, who led the research effort on the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine trials. And we'll be asking them what lessons must be learned from this pandemic to apply not just to global health in future, but how we can prepare ourselves for potentially a man-made pandemic. So thank you all very much. I'll see you then. That's at 1 o'clock.